Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young Kim. The year 2021 has finally arrived, and I wish all of our viewers happiness and good health. With the inauguration day for the new U.S. president is approaching, a large focus is put on the new Biden administration's North Korean policies, and North Korea is gearing up for its party Congress later this month. Analysts are keeping a close watch for any signs of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's approach to negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program with the U.S. President-elect Joe Biden. Today we'll discuss these and more. Joining us is Thomas Countryman, the chair of the Arms Control Association Board of Directors. Mr. Countryman previously served as the acting Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Michael O'Hanlon also joins us today. Mr. O'Hanlon is Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, specializing in the U.S. defense strategy and national security policy. He authored numerous books, including Crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Welcome to the program, and a Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy 2021.
First of all, many North Korean watchers are saying that the Biden transition team needs to review the North Korean policy as soon as possible and make some kind of signal to the North Korean regime before the reclusive country resorts to provocations. Mr. Countryman, do you agree with this view?
Certainly, the Biden team has been reviewing the policy approach towards North Korea throughout the campaign and throughout the transition. And I do expect that it will make a general statement of principles of its approach to North Korea early in the new term. But no one should expect, either in North Korea or South Korea, that this will be a primary focus of the president himself or of his administration. We have other crises in public health, in the economy, in terms of racial justice that require the president's more immediate attention than dealing with North Korea at his level.
Mm-hmm. Mr. O'Hanlon, what do you think? Is it too early for the Biden team to make public about their North Korean policies?
Well, first, let me strongly agree and reaffirm what Secretary Countryman just said. I think he is completely right that North Korea policy will not be a natural priority for Joe Biden, whether it should be or not. So there's the separate question about whether it should be a priority, but I fully agree that it will not be a priority. Too much else is on Joe Biden's mind. And in my experience in watching Senator and Vice President Biden over the years, I have never really thought that North Korea was for him one of his natural go-to interests. He actually wrote a nice blurb for the book that I wrote with Mike Mochizuki on North Korea 15 years ago, which was kind of him to do. But it wasn't because we had had extensive conversations about North Korea, and I don't know that he really ever was that involved in Obama administration policy on North Korea. So I think we have to expect, therefore, that Kim Jong-un may decide to try to make this issue a priority, whether Joe Biden wants it to be or not.
President-elect Joe Biden has recently said that his transition teams have encountered roadblocks from political leadership at some of the government offices. Mr. O'Hanlon, do you think it affects the transition team in a negative way when they're preparing for the North Korean strategies?
No, not really. For one thing, we don't really know of any evidence that there have been problems at the State Department, at least not that I'm aware of. I've heard about more problems at the Pentagon and at the Office of Management and Budget. But also, I think it's fair to say that President Trump's North Korea policy was essentially stuck for the last year and a half. And I say that as a person who was not completely against some of his personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, but I don't think he quite knew what to do with that personal diplomacy or with negotiating strategy in the last year and a half. And of course, we all know that Steve Biegun went from being an envoy on North Korea to then being given the portfolio of Deputy Secretary of State, which was essentially an acknowledgement that he had time on his hands because the North Korea talks weren't really going anywhere. So I don't know how much there is to say in these transition talks, even if the meetings themselves are happening more or less as they should.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Countryman, what is your assessment of the current situation?
I agree with Dr. O'Hanlon that this is not a crisis that the communication between Deputy Secretary Began and the State Department transition team, I understand, has been normal, as it should be. He's also correct when he says that we were in a static condition vis-a-vis North Korea. Nothing had happened really in the last year and a half. And so really the more important part of the briefing is not so much the policy briefing as the intelligence briefing. What has changed in the 4 years of the Trump administration in terms of the North Korean economy and especially in terms of North Korea's military capability? I hope that that transition is going well because those are facts that the new team will have to master very quickly.
And I'm sure the Biden transition has gone through the North Korean policies of the past administrations. Mr. Countryman, you were also involved in the Biden campaign. What kind of approach do you expect the Biden administration will take towards North Korea, most importantly in terms of denuclearization?
Well, I did help the Biden campaign going door to door and reminding people to vote. Nobody in the Biden campaign asked me for my opinion about North Korea. But of course, I have an opinion. And I think it's important that the Biden administration stress early on its commitment to the goal of denuclearization in the context of seeking a peaceful, normal relationship between the United States and North Korea. And it should, at the same time, in a very straightforward but not provocative way, remind the North Koreans that missile testing or nuclear testing, in order to draw attention to themselves, will set back any of the little bit of progress that has been made in the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Mr. O'Hanlon, what is your view on this? Do you have any advice for the new U.S. administration?
Well, yes, building on Tom Countryman's very good points, I would only add one more, which is that I also believe that a pragmatic step-by-step approach is more promising than going for the big enchilada with complete denuclearization all at once. We know about this acronym, complete irreversible disarmament and verifiable, so CID. But I don't think that's what the first deal can really achieve. I think that Kim Jong-un watched what happened to Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, and he concluded that he could not be at risk of a hostile relationship with the United States in the absence of a nuclear arsenal. He also inherited this arsenal from his father and grandfather. It's the family legacy. It's the product of a lot of North Korean effort. And I think that it's much more plausible that he would be willing to place some kind of a cap on the arsenal rather than eliminate it in all one fell swoop. And I think that should be our goal. So I've been an advocate of trying to eliminate the production capability, which of course also is much larger and more easily verified. Even if we're not 100% sure about where 100% of it is, we know where a lot of it is. And I think a partial lifting of sanctions in exchange for an irreversible and verifiable dismantlement of North Korean nuclear production capability, together with the ongoing moratoria on tests, that would be the deal that I would advocate for the next few years.
And North Korea is set to hold a party congress this month for the first time in nearly 5 years. Mr. O'Hanlon, what do you think will be the priority for Kim Jong-un at the Congress?
Well, we know that Kim Jong-un has had this concept of the young Jin, prosperity and safety or security. And my colleague, Jung Pak, who wrote a great book on Kim Jong-un, talked about his goals for turning Pyongyang into Pyonghattan, a play on Manhattan, almost a miniature Seoul. In other words, a modern city. And Kim being relatively young, I assume he doesn't want to spend the next few years or decades of his life in control of a failed state. So I think he's got to develop a strategy for economic recovery. We know that in the last 4 years, a combination of sanctions and COVID have retracted or reduced the North Korean economy by maybe 15%. GDP is much smaller now than it was 4 years ago. That creates some leverage for the Republic of Korea and the United States, but it doesn't necessarily produce a successful negotiating strategy. But I think we need to understand Kim Jong-un's got to be worried about that. He's probably much less concerned that we will preemptively attack him, given his artillery and his nuclear weapons, much more concerned about the economic squeeze.
Kim Jong-un is expected to unveil a new five-year economic plan as country's economic crisis deepens. But the border closure and sanctions are still in place. Mr. Countryman, can Kim Jong-un weather through this?
Historically, the North Korean regime has survived much tougher times than this. So the capability of the regime to force suffering upon the population is perhaps not unlimited, but it is very great. So I don't see a challenge to the stability of the regime. The other point about the Congress that may be interesting, frequently these Congresses are as much about politics as about economics. And so I think many of us will be watching to see if this is the moment where Kim's sister is promoted to a still more visible and more official role in the party hierarchy.
And there are many speculations as to what Kim Jong-un will talk about other than economic issues. Mr. Countryman, do you think Kim Jong-un will emphasize the country's nuclear capability?
Yes, I expect so. It is, as Mr. O'Hanlon just said, part of the legacy of his grandfather and father, and it is the only claim North Korea has to being a world power in any dimension. Now, the question that will be interesting is how he emphasizes it. Does he brandish it with the kind of fire and fury threat that Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim used to hurl at each other, or will he state it simply as a fact to be proud of before moving on to other topics? That may give some indication about his readiness to continue negotiations with the U.S.
Mr. O'Hanlon, what is your thought on this? Will North Korea regime use its typical threat tactics or just gently boast its nuclear weapons?
Well, I'm not a fan of Kim Jong-un, but I think he's reasonably smart. And I would expect that anything he would do, he would have thought ahead 2 or 3 steps. So for that reason, I would be surprised, maybe not completely shocked, but surprised if he did, let's say, a big nuclear test. A big nuclear test is pretty much an irreversible step towards a bad relationship for the foreseeable future. I would be less surprised to see a medium-range missile test or even perhaps another ICBM test, although the ICBM test is getting into pretty dangerous territory as well because it starts to make more credible a real threat to the North American homeland. So I think that if Kim doesn't see some initial movement, he probably will do some kind of military provocation. But he also needs to remember he and his generals really do appear to fear these large military exercises that historically have been done by the ROK and the United States together. And he probably doesn't want us to resume those. And he knows that we could, especially if his moratoria completely evaporate. My own view is this is actually a good deal for the United States and Republic of Korea because I think we can break our exercises into smaller pieces and still accomplish largely the same military purpose. But on the other hand, Kim Jong-un cannot find any other way to test nuclear weapons or ICBMs besides actually the real thing. And so I would like to see those moratoria continue, and I hope they will. But I think that Kim may make us worry that he's about to throw them away and sabotage them with an incremental, step-by-step process towards maybe an increasingly severe set of provocations that do not begin with a nuclear test or probably an ICBM test, but could start to move in that general direction.
And many people are keeping a close eye on the upcoming North Korean event because they wonder if the regime will send out some kind of a blunt messages for the new U.S. administration. Mr. O'Hanlon, do you think Kim Jong-un will put out some messages for the United States?
Well, I think the messages will be somewhat restrained. Just to reaffirm and reinforce what I was just saying, my guess is that Kim Jong-un hasn't quite figured out Joe Biden yet, although he had 8 years to watch him as vice president, but he probably doesn't quite know how Biden would handle North Korea. He doesn't know which people are going to be in place. I know a lot of the top Biden people who have been named so far, but most of them are not really Asia experts. They're not really people with a strong portfolio or personal history on North Korea. So my guess is that Kim Jong-un will be in an exploratory phase for a while, trying to test the waters and see how the Biden team may react.
Mr. Countryman, do you agree with the view that Kim Jong-un will test the waters?
Well, Mr. Kim always has multiple options. And certainly he and his father and grandfather have greeted new U.S. presidents with provocations and with surprises. I think it would be a mistake for Mr. Kim to do that at this time. In particular, as I said before, the Biden administration ought to make clear that provocations and testings will move backwards, whatever progress has been achieved. And perhaps the Biden team should consider making clear privately to the DPRK that a resumption of nuclear tests or of intercontinental ballistic missile tests will mean the resumption of large-scale military exercises in South Korea. There has to be a cost to the provocations, but we should not be provoked into overreacting to every step taken by Pyongyang.
And meanwhile, about a week ago, more than a dozen Chinese and Russian aircraft entered South Korea's Air Defense Identification Zone, which is also known as CADIZ. Mr. Countryman, how would you interpret this move at a time when the U.S. is going through a transition?
I'm not sure it's at all connected to the presidential transition. Both China and Russia have a habit of acting, as they would say, assertively, as we would say, provocatively, towards their neighbors in an effort to remind neighbors of their military strength. I can't figure out that there is some specific message that they are doing with the same kind of behavior that they do close to the airspace of both Western Europe and the United States.
Mr. O'Hanlon, your thought on this?
Yeah, I think that, again, Tom Countryman's right. And I think that South Korea should be careful not to get drawn into squabbles with these great powers that have more to do with the United States than with the ROK. So, certainly South Korea has every right to assert its control of its own airspace and territory. But beyond that, I would advocate, trying to handle this with a certain amount of calm. We've seen these kinds of provocations, infractions for many years. They don't necessarily tend to lead anywhere. They're just a constant source of irritation. They're meant to keep things a little bit on edge so we don't take our relationships for granted. So we think about Moscow and Beijing and the harm they can cause us or the dangers they can impose on us if we were inclined to forget. But they don't necessarily foreshadow anything that's going to be threatening to the ROK fundamentally. So I would tend to advise caution and calm.
My last question today. Biden has continued to emphasize the importance of the U.S. allies. How should U.S. reassure its alliance with South Korea when the country seems to be stuck in the U.S.-China rivalry? Mr. O'Hanlon first.
Well, the good news is that the ROK-U.S. relationship was certainly good in the Obama years, I think it's fair to say, and has been good historically, even with some problems from time to time. And going back to a more traditional form of alliance diplomacy, I think will be a natural strength of the Biden team. And also they're smart enough not to request the kind of quote unquote strategic flexibility that the Bush administration had asked from South Korea. In other words, allowing us to use U.S. forces on South Korean territory for any kinds of operations in the region vis-a-vis China and request that in advance, essentially a blank check. South Korea was correct to say no to the United States, and they should say no again. But I don't think the Biden team is going to make that request. Where we do need to see some fresh thinking is on North Korea policy, because the alliance did not have a good last 4 years. It did not have a good 8 years before that. It did not have a good 8 years before that. We have a bipartisan legacy in the United States and in South Korea of failure in trying to stop the North Korean nuclear program. And so we're going to have to be a little bit more creative. And there we cannot just fall back on what the Biden team might have done when most of them had jobs in the Obama administration.
And Mr. Countryman?
Well, I'm willing to give the Trump administration credit for trying something new with North Korea in high-level contacts. Where I criticized the Trump administration was in almost completely abandoning what should be fundamental to this process, which is the closest possible coordination among the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. There should be no U.S. move vis-a-vis North Korea that has not been completely discussed with Seoul and Tokyo. And I think it is important for both Seoul and Washington to rebuild this relationship, to affirm the importance of the alliance. And here, and this might be the most important message I have for all my friends in the Republic of Korea, it's crucial that this is a trilateral alliance. There are many domestic political reasons why Japan and the ROK have problems with each other. But those problems are small compared to the security threat that the ROK and Japan face from North Korea and, for that matter, from China. So if the ROK wants to see progress on the Korean Peninsula, part of the solution must be patching things up with Tokyo and having the best possible coordination in this crucial trilateral alliance.
And a fresh start is waiting for all of us. And as the new US government is getting ready to kick off, we'll have to watch closely whether and how the US and North Korea will be able to reset their relationship in the new year. Mr. Countryman and Mr. O'Hanlon, thank you so much for being with us today on the first show of the new year.
Thank you. I hope 2021 is a year full of blessing for all of my friends in the ROK.
Well said. Likewise.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.